everyone. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about my PhD research. And for any of you in the audience who may not have done a PhD on menopause, I'm going to introduce the topic and talk about the kind of biological approaches versus social approaches, because there's some broad streams of literature that don't intersect really very well. Talking very specifically about variation in timing of menopause, which is the thing that I'm really looking at. The adaptive onset hypothesis, which is a hypothesis I'm kind of testing to some extent and exploring, then tell you just specifically about my study, the results, and then perhaps we'll think together about implications. So what is menopause? Well, by menopause I don't mean hot flushes. I'm really just talking about a specific event. And it's actually quite an interesting thing to study because you don't know when it's happened. It's one of these things that you only realize later, right? Because the definition is the last menstrual period, at the time of the last menstrual period. And you don't call it the last menstrual period until 12 months have passed and there hasn't been another one. But of course, reality is much more complex than our definitions, and sometimes you can have a menstrual period after 12 months, but this is just a kind of standard definition. Menopause is also kind of the period of midlife during which this happens, but really when I'm talking about timing of menopause, I'm talking about the timing of the last menstrual period, rather than anything else. So there's actually been a fair amount of anthropological research on menopause, and it falls into these two camps. One is the kind of social anthropology studies of menopause, which started out really trying to explore menopause from a feminist perspective to counter a medicalization of menopause. So to kind of say that menopause is a natural process, it's not a disease, it doesn't need to be treated, and to use kind of a cross-cultural approach, so going out and doing different ethnographies to sort of demonstrate really for a Western, a Euro-American audience that other people think differently. And that other people experience it differently. So a lot of this stuff about people in X country don't have hot flushes, that kind of stuff. If you've ever heard any of that, that comes from this kind of social anthropology view of menopause. Then there's been the biological anthropology view of menopause, which too has had kind of two separate streams. One that really begins with this question: why should these old women exist? Why should people be around when they're not reproducing, especially women? And saying that it's quite a confusing thing that an organism should stop reproducing about halfway through its lifespan. Then there's been kind of quantitative research that's looked at the kind of details of how menopause happens. So who gets what symptoms, what predicts what symptoms. And in some ways that's kind of more biomedical than even biological anthropology. And then there's been this research on the variation in age at menopause. So these kind of questions about why menopause evolved often doesn't deal in any way with the experience of menopause in terms of what we call symptoms, or in why some people have it at 40 and some people have it at 65. So that's kind of where I'm coming in, because I'm interested in age at menopause with a bit of an evolutionary perspective. But in terms of variation in age at menopause, there is actually a wide variation. You might know that if you've ever spoken to people about when it happened. So there's individual level variation, so people within the same population having very widely differing times of menopause, but there's also differences between populations. So we can see that some populations on average have a much earlier time of menopause and other populations have a later time of menopause. And yeah, there's been lots of kind of research on this. But as I say, little link to evolution. And one paper has been published by a guy called Barry Cool. I'm not sure how he pronounces his own name because we've never met, but he's come out with this idea that the timing of menopause might be itself adaptive, so that it might be moving around for a reason. So Cool suggests that this variation in timing of menopause is to do with a kind of reproductive strategy that's responding to the environment. And he's positioning it very much in terms of the mothering hypothesis. So the idea that menopause evolved because of a woman's own possibilities of reproductive success, rather than being about grandmothers, but that it's about a woman's own reproductive kind of strategy. And two of the predictions that he makes are that relatively early menopause will be associated with relatively limited monetary resources. And another is that later menopause will be associated with having few children to invest in. He has a number of other predictions, but those are the ones that I'm looking at, but we'll talk about the rest of them later. So my study, I call it biosocial, but you could call it biocultural just as easily. It's a study of menopause, so I spent 15 months living in Bradford and kind of traveling around Leeds and Bradford and around West Yorkshire, hanging out with ladies, as they call them. Yeah, lots of cups of tea and lots of talking to middle-aged women. So if you don't know much about Leeds and Bradford, here's a bit of a picture of their Bradford's in there, and it's the biggest concentration of Pakistanis in the UK, like you might have heard, which is part of why people call it Bradistan. There are people, the Pakistanis in that region are normally from working class backgrounds. The majority are Muslim, and they're from I think they say that 90% of the Pakistanis in Bradford are from a single district in Pakistan, in an area that's called Azad Kashmir, that's not a neutral term, that's a political term, so it's a Pakistan-controlled Kashmir, a single district there. And they're quite a kind of geographically concentrated community. They're in particular neighborhoods. So I went and hung out there. I did semi-structured interviews using a questionnaire, and I took anthropometric measurements from women between the ages of 39 and 61. It actually turned out to be extraordinarily difficult to work out how old people were. So the age of natural menopause subsample I have is 95, but there's sometimes other details were difficult to ascertain, so I end up 95 to 91 women where I can actually look at the variation in the timing of menopause. And so the analyses that I'm going to be presenting today are ordinal logistic regression and multinomial logistic regression, in case you're the sort of person who finds that interesting. So here are my kind of categories of age at natural menopause that I'm comparing to each other. So why do some people end up in this one, some people end up in this one, and others end up here? And because of the way logistic regression works, I'm able to include women who are past the age of 51, but who haven't yet achieved menopause in this category here, because we know, well, if they don't die, it'll happen. So they belong in that category. Okay, so here's the first prediction that I looked at. So I predicted that, on the basis of the adaptive onset hypothesis, that women with more offspring would have later menopause. And that would be evidenced by a greater number of pregnancies and a greater number of children. So I tested those separately, because some people had more pregnancies than they had children. Right? That happens. Miscarriage. So okay, neither of those turned out to be correct. So they weren't. So my data didn't support either of those predictions. So I went on. So so looking at that monetary resource prediction that Kuhl talks about. So I predicted that markers of higher social or socioeconomic status, I wanted to not just think about it in terms of monetary resources, because I don't know if you've ever tried asking 257 Pakistani women what their household income is. It's not the sort of thing that should be done. So I predicted that having this higher social or socioeconomic status would be associated with a later menopausal age. And so I collected these variables: occupational social class, husbands, occupational social class, a variable called self-reported ladder status, which I'll tell you about, education level, so how many years of schooling. A lot of women were in kind of 0 years of schooling, so there was a range, and a history of having worked outside the home as a way of kind of trying to talk about income, really. This is about waged work rather than, and it turned out to be a bit more complex just because some people were doing sewing within the home, but I was really talking about wage labor here. Okay, so most of those predictions my data was not consistent with. But this self-reported ladder status thing, which was probably the least money-ish, turned out to have some association with age at menopause. So let me tell you a bit about that. So it's an idea that you get somebody's subjective social status, and I used it specifically with reference to the idea that this was where they were in terms of their community. So I asked women, in terms of your community, not giving them a definition of their community, but there's a clear idea that people have about who their community is. Where are you? Are you at the top of the ladder? Are you at the bottom of the ladder? Are you somewhere in between? And women were able to point at a rung And it's very simple. You just count the rungs, and you put that in as a variable. But I actually, because of the nature of my fieldwork and the relationships I had with women, it was very easy to talk with women about what went into placing yourself on this ladder. And women were quite, would talk about it. Well, we started out here, but then I've been able to marry my children into good households, and my husband is doing okay, and and to describe why they were where they were. And it wasn't that much about money, but there was a kind of economic element to it. So here's what we had in terms of the relationship between age at menopause and this kind of placing of people on a ladder. So because of how awkward statistics are, I ended up having to group the top half of the ladder and the bottom half of the ladder together. The top half together and then the bottom half. So a larger number of women in the natural menopause group put themselves up high, then put themselves a bit lower. But so there's an association there, a statistical association, but it's in the opposite direction to what was predicted, right? So it's not looking that great for the adaptive onset hypothesis at this point. And then I had these, which are kind of my thing, right? Because I was interested in this idea of maybe acculturation. Now, acculturation is a contested concept, but these are largely women born in Pakistan who came over to the UK at some point in their lives. And so I predicted that indicators of less acculturation would be associated with earlier menopause. And I used something called the Suilu Asian Self-Identity Acculturation Scale, which was a kind of questionnaire that asked about a whole range of things, which I'll talk. And then I used whether or not a woman had been born in Mirpur, which is that district from which so many people of Pakistani origin in the UK come. I asked about this biradri, this very specific kind of caste-related kinship group. And then I asked about being in a consanguineous marriage. And these... So this is a straightforward idea about acculturation, right? So this first one. So it's the idea that maybe women who are less acculturated will be more like women from Pakistan, who have a menopausal age on average much earlier. So it's from 44 sometimes to maybe 49 in terms of different studies, whereas the UK mean age at menopause is 50 to 52. So maybe I thought the less acculturated women will be more close to the Pakistani women. And these come from my kind of ethnographic data because people talk a lot about who is and who isn't acculturated. They don't use that term, obviously, because people don't, but kind of who was more kind of English and who was basically living just like they would in Pakistan, which obviously, I mean, it's not really true, but it's the terms in which people often talk. So I took those from kind of what people told me in interviews. But it turned out that the relationship was in the opposite direction to what I predicted. So that's challenging. But yeah, so the SLAsia has loads of stuff on there. It's an interesting thing. It had food and media. It was a really kind of a very complicated kind of scale, and it allowed people to be kind of bicultural as well as just highly Asian or highly Western. Right. So yeah, here I got something there, but maybe yeah. So having been born in Mirpur turned out not to be there wasn't a statistical relationship there, and the same with being in a consanguineous marriage. But these other two, I got something. But of course, one of them is in the opposite direction to what was predicted again. But the acculturation thing, that kind of worked.
How did it work?
Well, I'm coming to that. So here's the final model, right? So they didn't work so well because these are like, they're not. This is really under the kind of level of normal statistical significance, but kind of approaching it. So I put them in the final model just to see what would happen. And it turns out that actually when you put them together in a model together statistically, those variables, they become more significant, which is to say that they have independent relationships that are statistically significant, which is it's not important if that's not the language that you think in. But basically, something seems to be going on with these three variables, and it's not the same thing. So for the women from the Chaudhry Jat Biradri, they were more likely to be older at menopause. For the women who rated themselves highly on the ladder of social status, so saying, I'm a high status person, they were more likely to be younger at menopause. And for the women who said that they were highly Asian, they were more likely to be younger at menopause. So, just to put that into words again, just for those of you who aren't numbers people. So, yes, so the British Pakistani women who were from that biradari that gets talked about as being kind of the most Pakistani of the Pakistani, they had a later menopause than the women from the other biradaris. So we'll explore this.
And that's not what you expected?
No. Yeah. And the women who put themselves high on the ladder were more likely to have an earlier menopause, which is not what was predicted. And the women who were less acculturated were more likely to have an earlier menopause, which I got something. And each of those was independent of the other, so it's three different things going on in some kind of way. But basically, the adaptive onset hypothesis wasn't supported. And that's not just me. Nobody has found data that support the adaptive onset hypothesis. So this is the only one that I had guessed. But let's talk it through, right? Because I have the ethnographic data to help us think through these things. I collect it myself, so I know what it means. I don't just mine other people's ethnographies, right? So the women who were less acculturated were more likely to have an early menopause. But it's really interesting because that relationship that people talked about acculturation and being from this particular group, this biradari, called the Chaudhry Jats, they were actually related. But something else is going on. So it wasn't that these Chaudhry Jat women were less acculturated. It was actually, it's a more complex thing than just being in that kind of less acculturated group. And it turned out that this acculturation thing wasn't just about how long you've been in the country, which I guess if you know anything about immigrant populations, maybe you could guess. But there was a relationship between acculturation and the timing of migration. But actually, that doesn't seem like it's what's responsible, because timing of migration has no statistical relationship with age at menopause, at least in my sample. So it makes us think, what are we actually looking at when we look at things like acculturation? So you could say, as I was thinking originally, that maybe it's about lifestyle. Are people living the way they might in their Pakistani village? And I don't think so. I think it actually has to do with the kind of social dynamics of kind of life in Bradford for a not very acculturated woman, right? Because we didn't have a whole bunch of people who were really highly Western, who were like, I'm basically British. So not in my sample, which is, Pakistani women aged 39 to 61. Actually, we got people who were a little bit British by their own estimation, but not very. And I think actually there's something for us to think about how acculturation might not just be harmonizing yourself in some beautiful way with the society around you, but actually might be something that creates kind of tension. But yeah, it's just an interesting thing for us to think about what we might be really looking at. But anyway, these less acculturated women had an early menopause. And because we can think about an early menopause, we can think about it in terms of just being more like Pakistanis, or we can think about it and I guess this is the shift that I would like to take place as I'm talking about this, is to think about early menopause as being rapid aging of the ovaries, a shorter reproductive lifespan, potentially, right? So it's the body saying no to reproduction, no.
So it could be a result of stress, of being outsiders.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, when we're thinking about migration studies, maybe we sometimes we lose some of the detail of what it means to be an immigrant. But okay, so back to this biradari thing, right? So I haven't explained what it is, but biradaris have caste names. You'll be familiar with caste from everything that's ever been said about India. But they're not kind of castes either. They're kind of patrilineal kinship groups in another way. But it doesn't mean that people are actually related to each other, right? Because kinship is complicated and doesn't map onto biology. So they're not necessarily biologically related. This ancient, person who the patrilineage is supposed to be descended from may never have existed. Yeah, basically, it's a relationship that people have to each other that has some relation. It's kind of, there's a hierarchy to it, but maybe it's not anything to do with biology. And I would say that in the context of living in the UK, it's a support system. And one way you know it's a support system is that people who are not part of a large biradari, or biradari that's well represented in an area, are really annoyed at how wonderful life is for the people who are in the larger groups. They struggle to get candidates into local elections. They struggle to kind of hand out jobs and make the kind of relationships that they want to be able to make. So exchanging marriages and finding business partners and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's a key to thinking about this, because when I tried to talk about this with some medical people, they were like, yes, consanguineous marriage is a genetic thing. But I don't think it is. I think it's actually about these kinds of kinship, right, not biological relatedness. And Bill Dressler's work, if you're not familiar with Bill Dressler, he's fantastic. A lot of his work has looked at how social support, how having these kind of networks of salient relationships, the social relationships that you have that are kind of meaningful, whether that's just meaningful in a kind of psychological way, not in terms of the discipline of psychology, but in terms of kind of emotions and all of that, but also things that actually provide you with kind of support and help. These things might actually influence these things have been demonstrated to have some relationship to human physiology. So how well your body is working seems to be related to whether you have the salient set of social relationships for your environment. So whether it's having a husband or whether it's having the right kind of friends or whatever, there seems to be a relationship there. Right? But why this one? And it's because I separated the Chaudhry Jats from all the others, and it's because they are considered a distinct group. In Bradford, they're considered a distinct group. Because they've been extremely successful at local chain migration, so that means that one person pulls the next person along the chain. So they're a really big group, and they have a lot of political power. So it made intuitive sense to compare them to others. Okay, so now to this social status ladder, because again, that's the third thing that we're looking at. So the women who are on the top, who placed themselves on the top of the ladder, had an earlier menopause, right? And that's really different from what the adaptive onset hypothesis was kind of trying to get at. It was trying to say this, something about high status being positive, so having a longer reproductive lifespan if you're doing well in terms of status. And in fact, it's the opposite of all other studies that have looked for a relationship between status and menopause. And I think, again, that we have to think about the context very specifically, where social status and social resources might actually be in a kind of a disjuncture from each other. So lots of literature that talks about Pakistanis and lots of other immigrant group talks about kind of status inconsistency. But there's a broader literature about status inconsistency that kind of links status inconsistency with negative health outcomes. So status inconsistency is when you actually are denied the status that you believe you deserve, you believe you should have achieved. So you may feel, I'm a high status person, except nobody is respecting me, and I have nothing to show for that. And that comes out a lot in my interviews. So women saying, I don't know why I've made all of this effort in life to become this person. I think I should be a high status person, because nobody respects it. I have to, from the point of view of the kind of menial labor I have to do in my days, to the way people treat me on the street, it's just not working out. But it also means that there's an interesting thing thinking about this social status ladder, because Pakistanis are very hierarchically kind of conscious. They believe that human beings kind of sit in a hierarchy. So I wasn't imposing the idea of status on them. It was quite intuitive to them that people would be on a ladder. But actually, being up high on a ladder can mean that you get less social support, right? Because people really socialize within their kind of rung. Being high up in a world where, in a situation where actually you're not achieving much by being high up, and because status is often, kind of pyramid, you make yourself have fewer kind of people who are there to socially support you, added to which you have the frustration of not being able to achieve anything through all of what you and your family think they've accomplished. So that comes out of the interviews as well as coming out of this kind of quantitative analysis. So I think we have to nuance the way we think about status. And I want to just cast our eyes back down. So this is the full list of Kuhl's predictions. So here, what he talked about was monetary resources, right? So, okay. And I kind of interpreted that. I took more direct measures of monetary resources, the most direct I kind of could. But I don't know what measure Kuhl would have wanted me to use, whether he would have wanted me to use a kind of raw income, take-home pay, whether did it matter, what were we comparing against? And do we really believe, I mean, what's the mechanism by which our ovaries know what's in our bank account, right? I think maybe actually it makes more sense to think about it in terms of social resources, because, I mean, the only thing I can think of, and I'm willing to talk this through, is that monetary resources might translate to more food, so that's not going through social resources, but I don't know, furthermore, I think, we don't know when menopause evolved, but it was a good long time ago. Before money, to be sure. So what are we thinking about? And I also want us to think about that in terms of how many times this list mentions husband, which I have an issue with. But I think, another interesting thing is that this biradri, when you look at it in a kind of in-depth way, right, with the kind of ethnographic context, biradri begins to look a bit like this prediction of Kuhl. It has to do with kin who can help you raise children.
That's.
And I don't know how sophisticated Kuhl's understanding of kinship is. It maybe let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he knows what first-year anthropology undergraduates know, which is that kinship is not the same as biological relatedness. So maybe he's onto something here, because I think that's something to think about. But I think again we have to think about who are the people who would help you raise your future offspring, and that has to be understood in a local context. That's not just a given. And they may not be in any way related to you. But there is a reason to think why our ovaries might be looking out for the question of who around us would help us in the situation where we were having another baby. But again, yes, just pointing out this idea that this actually focuses very much on the idea of a husband. And I can understand why Kuhl, from the perspective of his own culture, thinks that's important, but I have a problem with it myself. Right. Anyway, I'm just really interested in your thoughts. I need to acknowledge the people who helped me do the research, including the women and the people who gave me money to go and hang out and have cups of tea. Yeah.
Questions? So, how did you gain access to these women? Because they're fairly conservative, especially the women at that age.
Yeah.
They're the ones least likely to go out of their community. So, how did you manage to get out and to get them to talk?
So that was because I'm not Pakistani, and so I had no kind of in, and I didn't know anyone in Bradford. So I don't know. I guess I just did what anthropologists do, which is kind of go hang out and try to make friends. I'm not 40 to 60. I don't know. How did I do it? I hung out and told people I needed to do some research. I think I got access largely because people thought that there was something a bit pathetic about this idea that I was out trying to talk to ladies about weird stuff, and that I had no children, and they thought that maybe this would somehow help me be able to have children. I think that was genuinely the thing that was in people's minds, was that I was doing this, and I remember one woman saying to me, because it's a standard practice to ask how many children a person has. Well, I don't have children. How interesting. Is that why you're going door to door all over this neighborhood?
So you let them believe that, so you could get this.
Well, I mean, it wasn't entirely untrue. I mean, I wasn't interested in having a child during my PhD fieldwork, but I mean, they saw a relationship, and I mean, they always saw a relationship between my childlessness and everything that was going on with me. So I remember being really emotionally overwhelmed by some people being very obnoxious to me and just having a bit of a cry, hiding out behind somewhere, and a woman coming and being like, "You will have children one day. Don't let it get to you." So I think there was nothing I could do. I also couldn't convince people that my name was Mwenza. No matter what I did, people were very convinced that my name was Mwenza. and that I was just too ignorant to know how to pronounce my name. So while I was able to gain access, I wasn't in a position of any kind of power over these women.
And even the language as well, because not all of them speak very good English.
They don't, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I had to learn. I made a whole lot of effort. This like standard stupid anthropologist stuff. So I made a lot of effort to learn Urdu because everyone was like, yes, Urdu. Pakistanis speak Urdu. And then I got out there and nobody spoke Urdu. People were like, your Urdu is very good. And I was like, oh my God, you don't speak Urdu if you think that. So then I had to learn the kind of dialect of Punjabi that people were speaking. It was challenging. But I worked with interpreters because it was just impossible for a while. But and then they were like kind of gatekeepers and would go along with me during interviews and help.
Were they women?
They were women, yeah. They were Pakistani women from there, yeah.
Hi. I had an interesting experience in India, in Pune, where I was staying for some months. And I was walking along and noticed that a new settlement had arrived underneath the entrance, like a runway, of motorway. And it was quite a large settlement, and I just found myself wanting to find out more and went to mix with these women. And one woman approached me. She was around my age, I was in my 30s. And her hands were so warm, I just assumed that she was a very healthy woman. Also, her hand grip was extraordinarily strong. You know, almost painful for me to have this handshake, which I suppose would actually be normal in her culture, but she knew to shake my hand as an English woman. And everything about her just suggested she was a very, very healthy, strong, capable, and very kind of courageous woman, the way that she came to me. Her eyes were sparkling, and I'll never forget meeting that woman. It was a moment of great insight, because I perhaps approached with feeling very sad for these people living in this situation. She was much healthier than me. I really, honoured her as a woman.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think people have kind of assumptions about what South Asian women are like that are just baseless. Just that they're very meek and quiet and kind of downtrodden. And like certainly Pakistani men and South Asian men have got a lot to answer for in terms of just bad things they do. But it doesn't mean that people don't have any kind of oomph about them at all. Yeah.
Been through that mill.
Yeah, exactly. And because women's world is kind of a world of their own, especially among South Asian Muslims. And you have status within that. You're not in a status hierarchy with men. That's like another world.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was kind of thinking about it, that for women in this culture, is status actually achieved by becoming older and going into menopause because of the sort of stages of becoming a mother-in-law with sons who have marriage and so on, and that won't be, whereas it might look the opposite from a very westernised point of view, that you get older and you're past it now, and so the whole thing about menopause is it doesn't have the same kind of dynamic.
Yeah, and well, it's but it's I suppose people still have complex feelings about it, because it kind of means also being unpolluted, but also kind of not sexual, maybe not so beautiful, maybe not able to wear beautiful clothes anymore. So kind of a whole transition that actually people have lots of different feelings about. But ultimately, yeah, it's around the same time when you get your daughters-in-law who do for you. Yeah.
What do you feel about the findings that you got? I mean, you've actually given us a lot of sort of hard evidence, statistics, but you haven't really said very much. You said what Mr. Cool, or whatever his name is.
Yeah.
But you haven't said what you thought or what you expected, even.
Well, I suppose I didn't. I was really interested in just seeing. Well, I was going into it. I didn't know whether people would even tell me when their last menstrual period was. I just had no kind of clue. And he published his paper while I was in the field. So I thought it was interesting because I was already really thinking about menopause in terms of timing of menopause in terms of being some kind of environmental response, as a lot of people have, just sort of saying, you know, because we know that sometimes you stop ovulating in certain conditions, and it's a bit like, you know, the ultimate turning off of reproduction rather than the kind of temporary thing. So I thought it would be responsive to social conditions. And then when I saw what he thought, I thought, wow, I feel like it's not all that well thought through. Because for example, he thinks there's a threshold for conception of pregnancy, and we know that's not true.
Yeah. You mean a fat threshold?
Yeah, it's not as straightforward as that. You don't see a kind of simple threshold effect.
You don't even have to be having...
Would it be a good idea, Mwenza, just talk through a little bit more on Cool's theory, and so for people who don't know much about it?
Yeah.
Perhaps could I just add, while you're doing that, when I see that theory, it just seems that it has nothing whatever to do with, and in fact completely inconsistent with everything I know about biological anthropology, with the theories I'm familiar with about the grandmothering thing and the onset, you know, the kind of supposed mystery of was. You seem to be saying the opposite of what I would have thought. Anyway, so can you say a little bit about?
Yeah. So he stays. I think he's putting the kind of idea of grandmothers kind of behind, and really thinking in terms of when it would be advantageous to continue reproducing for the woman herself, and when it would be advantageous to stop reproducing. I mean, this is kind of giving a nod to the next generation because it's talking about children reaching reproductive age. But again, I couldn't use that because what is reproductive age? Because that, I think, is not as straightforward as it might sound. It's not reproductive maturation. And certainly, I mean, to talk about reproductive maturation, the population I'm working in would just be ludicrous because it's not about your age. It's about, you know, whether you've been through marriage. So he's thinking about it very much in terms of, in the same way that in certain really negative conditions, we consider it an evolved strategy, whether it is or not, that you would stop ovulating. And that's, so we've demonstrated that happens under a certain amount of energetic stress. So when actually we reckon it would probably be a bad idea, you wouldn't be able to carry a successful pregnancy. You might damage yourself because you don't have enough food, you don't have enough energy, or you're expending much more than you're eating. So in those conditions, you would stop ovulating so you can't get pregnant. And similarly, kind of trauma. So when we think that's through hypothalamic pituitary adrenal kind of activation that stops you then from being able to reproduce again, your ovulation stops. So he's thinking of it. So he's thinking of menopause in those terms. He doesn't make this clear, and he's coming from a much more kind of evolutionary psychology point of view. So he refers to a kind of brain mechanism.
Is there actually evidence, though, that those mechanisms happen? That that under stress you do actually.
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
Earlier menopause.
Oh, under earlier menopause. Yeah. So the menopause literature has not treated it. The ones that have looked at early and late menopause, or a range of ages, hasn't looked at it in an evolutionary way. It's just kind of gone oral contraceptive use. Yes. High school education, yes, and then all the studies are really inconsistent, and it's just kind of the kind of quantitative research that often gets done, almost like epidemiological stuff like
that. So basically, no theory behind it. Basically.
Right. I mean, I can't say for sure. I've met some of these people, and when I say, "Ooh, I'm interested," they go, "I hadn't thought of that." So most of them, they find different kinds of effects, but not necessarily with this kind of theory in mind. In terms of the cessation of ovulation under stress, that has been studied with an evolutionary kind of eye. So a lot of the work of definitely Peter Ellison at Harvard has been the kind of backbone of understanding why some people, what lactational amenorrhea, so when you don't ovulate because you're breastfeeding, how does that work? And thinking about all of that kind of stuff in terms, because it used to be thought of just in terms of pathology. It used to be thought of as like, your body's breaking for a bit and then it gets fixed. But it seems to be, but actually we can think of it in evolutionary terms rather than just in terms of. Yeah. So he's kind of trying to apply that to menopause.
Sorry, is this based on any ethnographic work, or did he just sit in his office?
He just made it up, I think.
Where was it published?
Oh.
I mean, it doesn't matter exactly where it
I
is.
can't remember. I might have a.
That's naughty.
Sorry, I shouldn't ask that. Too much. I just wondered, was it in an anthropological journal like anthropology, or was it in a medical journal?
silly. I made it up.
Maturitas. So that's a specifically a menopause-focused journal.
I see.
And is it unusual to have evolutionary theory in journals like that?
Yes.
Quite unusual.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And no doubt it's going to be from a Western perspective.
Absolutely.
Ignoring everything else, all the cross-cultural references and everything. Just sat in his office and came up with this.
I think so, yeah. Yeah.
Husband mentioned everything.
What about did you try collecting data on husbands to check this out, or you had this reaction against it? But
well, no. So what you would need it's about your study design. So I had a cross-sectional study design. So a husband with poor health at time 2 doesn't tell me whether the poor health made the menopause happen. So if you were to and Cool himself has tried to publish some stuff. They haven't been able to find this even where they've got longitudinal data. So, but yeah, absence of a husband. I mean, people. There were so few. So there were. Well, yeah, and then I had a quite a difficult problem asking about whether people's husbands were dead that emerged in my interview process. Just because of the way people answer the question, "Are you married?" They say, "Yes, I'm married," and they don't say, "Are you widowed?" And then when you come to find out that they're widowed, but then you can't ask that question, "Is your husband dead?"
And you can't ask, "Has he run off with someone?" either, can you?
Exactly. Yeah. So where I knew the husband had had extra pair relationships because he had another wife, because that's permissible in Islam. It was actually a really small number. But then again, did he have that extra pair relationship? Well, after she was menopausal, or was it before? The chronology has to work out right before you can demonstrate.
The older husband, because that's easy.
Well, so the whole thing. Well, no, again, because so older than what?
Yeah, older than what? Given men can have
like older
kids
than the woman? Yeah, exactly. And then I had such an enormous amount of trouble figuring out how old these women were.
Oh.
Everything else was just like in the background. And sometimes it would be 20 minutes of different kinds of questions to work out how old a woman was.
So that's quite an interesting cultural thing in itself, that you really can't determine how old the women are.
And it means a lot of people are publishing nonsense.
That's right.
It means that other people who are going, here are my ages of my people. They're just making, because people will give you an answer. If you have no rapport, or if you send out somebody to do a questionnaire, they'll kind of go, what age are you? And people go, okay, my passport says this. And they know it's not true. But because you're in with people, they kind of go, so, do you want a passport one? And it took me a little while. Because people all got the same date of birth. And I thought, I was all like, oh, are they all reproducing? Is this a seasonal birth effect? I was thinking, count back 9 months? It's not. Because everybody was born on the 1st of the 1st. Which are just fake birth dates. And everybody who's kind of within the community knows that. But it took me, I was like, the 1st of the 1st again. But then that was like the beginning of the field work, and then I kind of got like, oh, okay, is that a real one? And they would go, no, of course not. But I don't think it's the right year either. I don't think
they didn't actually know, or is it they just didn't want to let you know?
No, because how does it's an epistemological question. How does anyone know when they were born? All you know is what you've been told. You just can't possibly. Yeah, that's all there is to it. So it makes you ask, why do we trust anything? You don't know where you were born. You know when you were born. So, the idea that. So they were like.
So how come they don't know when they're born?
Because nobody wrote it down.
Yeah. So the handset you wouldn't know.
They have different calendars anyway.
Yes, exactly. In Pakistan, there are no less than 3 calendars operating at the same time. So.
Can you tell us about calendars?
So there's a kind of agrarian calendar that's a kind of South Asian thing. It's kind of continuous with the rest of South Asia in the sense of it's like a Hindu calendar. Then there's a Muslim calendar, which is a lunar calendar and doesn't coincide with the Hindu calendar. And then of course the calendar that you are all familiar with the 12 months. So they overlay and not in any kind of neat way.
Would you expect a different result if later you interviewed the women's daughters?
Yes,
and
absolutely.
What would you anticipate from that?
Well, I think the acculturation thing will work very differently. I think there'll be different kinds of dynamics that'll be going on. There's definitely in younger women more of a focus on husbands because it's less of a kind of woman's world, at least at present. So when you look at younger women, they kind of don't just operate in the same way. So I think husbands may become, the relationship with the husband may become a more kind of salient kind of social predictor in terms of what we're talking about in terms of social status and all of this. So I think maybe husbands will become more important.
The question is that would you expect the daughters to have a menopausal time that is more like their mums, or more what you predict from the social environment?
I think it'll be more it'll be influenced by social environment probably just as much. Some people may move toward a sort of more British kind of age at menopause, but so there's been this work in the States, right, that has found that different ethnic groups in the States are having different kind of ages at menopause, and some of that is down to kind of experiences of depression or just experiences of trauma. They're different in different groups.
When you had a very brief sort of survey earlier on the talk of the various biological and anthropological theories for menopause, you mentioned what's apparently a theory is how on earth is it, why on earth are these women still alive kind of thing. What's the point of being around if you're not reproducing kind of stuff? But I'm sure there is that theory, but most of the theories I'm aware of aren't quite so stupid. Most of the things I'm aware of seem to think the evolution of menopause is a fantastic, sophisticated thing which very few species do, possibly elephants and some cetaceans, and humans are sort of the pinnacle of this. It's a huge explanation for all the extra childcare. Wonderful, one of the main explanations for the emergence of language, culture, and everything else. So, who are these people who think, what on earth are they doing while they're still alive?
Well, that's kind of where it all begins, right? It's the same as all the evolutionary stuff about homosexuality. How could this? Why?
It's the self-gene approach, memoir, and so on.
So I think that the starting point of like that it even now, when you look at papers that are kind of dealing with menopause, they kind of begin, a lot of these evolutionary papers are just really repetitive. Isn't it weird? It's so weird. Why half your lifespan not reproducing? That should have been selected out. So we work around and we figure out why it might have been. So it's still kind of a standard kind of thing. And it's similar, but the medical papers are very similar, which have no evolutionary stuff, which just tells you kind of this patriarchal stuff.
Haven't these people heard of selfish gene theory? I mean, don't they know about fitness? Do they really think it's...
So the medical papers...
It's quite hard to work out on a selfish gene basis.
It's hard, but
it's very hard to model on that basis.
And I guess where I think there is something going on about kind of about social relationships and timing of reproduction. I think there is the level of the generation that you're in about your menopause. I don't think it's all about the next generation. I think there is something about your own conditional strategy, as you might call it, and preservation because it is.
Sorry, butting in again. Is there some element of heritability? I heard from the Petre studies and so on that there was some element of heritability in age of menopause. So you'd be arguing that will be overridden by social and cultural effects.
Yeah. Because I think it's it's also like what heritability studies can kind of tell you is so limited in the impossibility of separating from environment in practice, which is why the next generation may have some of the same kind of factors. And that wouldn't be necessarily kind of the genetic component, but there seems to be some genetic component. I mean, because one of the factors is how many eggs you start out with, right? So that happens inside your mother's body.
Yeah.
But I think epigenetics will probably be that's certainly the direction a lot of it is taking, is the epigenetic effects of being in your mother's womb while your eggs are forming or your ovarian follicles are forming, and how that number varies between people. Sorry.
Starting off 3 questions. I've got a couple I suspect quite short answers. Were there any women in your sample that hadn't had children?
Yes.
Or that were?
Yes.
That hadn't been married and then hadn't had children, or that?
Yeah.
Sorry, what's the question?
How many
Were there
women
women in
who?
the sample who either hadn't been married or hadn't had children, or both?
Yeah, a really small number. So I wasn't able to make any kind of comparisons because there has to be a certain number. It doesn't work out statistically. I managed to kind of ferret out some women who are really, really different from everyone else.
And why were they not married or did they not have children? Was it biological or?
Oh, no. So I did meet lots of women who had had kind of infertility problems that had ended marriages, but it's really difficult to predict infertility before somebody gets married anyway, so, and you don't reproduce outside of marriage. Is the kind of rule for 40 to 60-year-old Pakistani women. So there were some women who'd been left because of infertility or had infertility problems. But I can only remember right off the top of my head now, one woman who was not married and didn't have children, and she had chosen not to get married. Yeah, and she was like, by all accounts, I am a very special, interesting person. So, you know what I mean? Like, it's not, because I talk with people sometimes and they go, oh, your work is so stereotypical because these women all have children and stuff, and why don't you give a voice to the other women? And I'm like, well, yeah, they have voice, and their voice is, boy, I'm weird. Not stop with the stereotypes. They believe themselves to be quite unique if they're different in these ways. Even women.
Had she gone through the menopause?
One or two children.
Weirder?
Yeah.
She had.
Yeah.
And how old was she?
47?
When she went through the menopause?
This I don't remember. I didn't record that in my brain. I recorded how old the person was.
Okay, so she wasn't that old though. She was 47 and she'd already... So even that didn't help. Complete abstention didn't prolong
her reproductive lifespan.
Yeah.
No, complete abstention. They just never married.
Oh yeah. I mean, it would be wrong. She would not appreciate it if I implied that she'd had sex.
Would you like to tell us of any sort of strain that intellectually on your part, like you're in this community, you've got a really strong focus on the menopause, but you must have been slightly interested in the percentage of people who self-identified as lesbian, perhaps possibly, and all kinds of other things which you might be interested to hear about.
Yeah, so because it was broad-based kind of ethnographic fieldwork, so I found out about all sorts of things, and people were very reluctant to talk about menopause. So it was very easy to find out about everything other than what I was focused on the way. Had a good number of conversations about kind of LGBT kind of issues, but none of these women identified as lesbians, and the conversations were often like, "Did you know that there are these women out there, and this is why you mustn't give your children to other women if you don't know them, because even women are not safe sometimes. Did you know that?" Which I would say, oh, really? So yeah, there was no kind of representation of lesbians in my sample, and no, I didn't. And I didn't meet a single person in the fieldwork who was open to me about any other sexuality besides heterosexuality. It's really outside of Bradford, I've met loads of people of different sexualities, from South Asian backgrounds.
Perhaps they get thrown out of Bradford if they're queer.
Well, and you just kind of, I think you feel like you're bursting at the seams a little bit because it's a fishbowl.
And also, I think we have to make a distinction here about the lesbians, because some people identify as lesbians, whereas some don't necessarily identify as lesbians, but
I
see it in other cultures.
Exactly. So desire, behaviour, identity, nothing to do with each other necessarily.
Yes.
But nobody identified as a lesbian. But I was not privy to any information that would imply that there was, kind of sexual behaviour that wasn't heterosexual going on. So nobody. And people were very open to me about sex in general, often about how awful it is, but not.
Well, that's another sexual question about orgasm, because there's all kinds of expert reviews that say women don't have orgasm all over the place. I don't know,
Except quite a lot of research that looks at clitoridectomy and saying that women do have orgasms after clitoridectomy, which is interesting. That question hasn't been asked necessarily outside of that too much. Sorry.
Yeah. This is, I'm not an anthropologist, but I imagine that it's a very fascinating aspect of being an anthropologist, whether when you're collecting data, whether you're getting what we Western educated would label truthful.
Yeah.
When my little experience of travelling is that very often I've observed that people want to please me by giving me the answer that they think I want to hear.
Yes.
And once I was left standing, for instance, standing at a bus stop for quite a long time, and eventually found out that no buses ran to that bus stop. It wasn't really a bus stop. I'd been told to wait there. And things like that. And I can imagine that...
they thought that would please you. like you.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was so pleased to be able to help him in what he thought was helpful.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
but I've met this kind of thing,
Yeah.
going on a lot. And when people arrive here and they're living in a place like Bradford, there must be quite an interesting metamorphosis of what's truthful, what's reality, and all that stuff. It would be a fascinating subject.
Well, yeah. So it's a really quite a really live issue, kind of what people are telling you, and definitely an interview has a performative aspect, which is not to say that there's which is not to call people liars, but people, there is a certain performativity, and I can understand those performances again because I spent so much time in the field. I understand what the performances, the performative aspect kind of is. A lot of this was kind of based on how many children you have. Now, if people had hidden children, they had hidden children, but people were often open to me about, this is not really my child. Secret adoption, don't tell anyone. So, and I think also, but I think what helped me in terms of the data I was collecting, that where I really wanted it to be true, was that nobody cared what I thought. I was just not an important person. And so there's a lot of anthropological literature that says the anthropologist is this kind of powerful person who kind of goes in and tells everyone what their culture is. And I mean, absolutely not. So I was told off all the time in all kinds of ways and considered just not an important person. And I suppose everything about me just screamed that I was not important. And that you could kind of get me in the house and I would do people's ironing. And be told off for not drying the dishes well. And I was actually quite poor at ironing, particularly shalwars, So I think I wasn't respected enough to be lied to about anything for my part. If people were lying, they were lying about themselves in a way that was important for them and not for what I was doing, because, that, yeah. And so, I think it's an advantage, because I think some other people may have gotten, what you've heard about Muslims is not true, whereas I got, a different kind of story. And because I've met other researchers who've been to Bradford, and they go, I've come back with this important counter-narrative. And it's kind of like, maybe, yeah. I mean, there's truth in what they want to say as well. It's like it all has anthropological value, but you wouldn't put that into a regression. I don't know if that answers your question. Somebody else had their hand up.
Yeah, I did. I wondered if there was a relationship between the time of menopause and the number of children.
Right. No.
There's a high.
I looked for that because that's what Cool thought.
Cool.
No. And I had a wide range of numbers of children. So you had the women who were getting told off for just having the 1 or 2 kids, and then people who had 13 pregnancies. So.
Yeah, just on that point, I always wondered if anybody had any sort of abortions, and sort of self-selected abortions because they can't, not legally obviously, they can do it because they can't afford to have the kids, so they can't do the family planning either.
So lots of family planning, actually. No problem with family planning.
Question, I just couldn't hear it.
So, a sex-selective abortion and general family planning.
Yeah.
Loads of people. People were like, coil, it's fantastic. I've had a coil for years. So no problem with, people taking tablets, not maybe liking tablets, which I think is understandable. Not a lot of people taking injections, but yeah, huge engagement with family planning. For years, using it as a spacing method. So people being like, yeah, I had a coil for 2 years until I wanted my next kid. Then I had another coil. Like they thought that it was kind of weird that I was asking, because they just thought that's how you kind of space the family. Spacing is good.
That's they do that because they're here. They wouldn't be doing that in Pakistan. Right?
Well, they wouldn't have access.
Yeah, they wouldn't have access.
Yeah, and yeah, people use contraception in Pakistan.
Really?
Yeah, and lots of really, it becomes really awkward sometimes to ask about these things, right? Because you guys have heard of coitus interruptus, right? There's no word for that. So it becomes like really. So I had the misfortune of doing another study that was specifically looking at kind of infertility and contraception, and I had to interview men for that, it was horrendous. It was an awful experience. It was basically asking about sex, because Pakistanis are not like, oh, contraception isn't sex. That is a conversation about sex. So yeah, people had to kind of try to describe what coitus interruptus was, and an idea that is what men do, especially back in Pakistan. It's dead easy. Why wouldn't you? And then, not a huge amount of engagement with condoms, but nobody. The only abortion I heard about was not a sex-selective abortion, and was initiated, well, the explanation was that it's initiated through, so Unani Tab is this kind of humoral Greco-Arab medical system that heat, cold, wind, these things. And so a woman said that she had managed, there was lots of talk about how you might manipulate the humors and produce certain effects. So make yourself have a period. And that included make yourself have a period while you're pregnant. And then and induce a miscarriage that way. And people, believed that was totally possible. And a woman told me that that's what she had done when she didn't want to be pregnant. But she had not had an ultrasound before that. It was like her first contact with medical care was when she was having the miscarriage.
Did any women talk to you about the ratio of male-female and how perhaps that was managed?
Well, huge numbers of women. So Pakistanis don't just want to have sons at all. There's two studies I've done. A lot of what has come out is that a perfect family has 2 boys and 2 girls, because you fulfilled your responsibility to everyone. So your daughters can't say they don't have a sister. Your sons can't say they don't have a brother, so nobody's alone, and so it's considered kind of that's the ideal. So they don't just want boys, not necessarily wanting really tiny families. So men often talked about the financial cost of having these big families, but lots of conversation about, but 4 is the right number if you've got 2 and 2. And so,
about the possibility of infanticide or something really horrible going on, did you ever touch in on that?
Nobody talked about it in Bradford. Nobody talked about it in the northeast of England in my other study either. And I heard about a number of horrendous and gruesome things going on, but not infanticide. Yeah, people would just go, "Shall we try for another?" And lots of conversations about this kind of gambling idea that we had 3 sons. I'd love a daughter. Oh, I'd love a daughter. How will I trick my husband into trying again? Or my husband wants to try again because he loves girls, and so it wasn't such a, it wasn't just, I think some of the studies, there was a terrible newspaper piece and paper that was sort of implying that South Asian women were having these secret abortions. And the stats on that were, I hope the person who wrote that paper is not in this room, the stats on that were very poor, extremely poor.
Was that in Pakistan? Was that including Pakistan?
No, that was on the UK, claiming that people were secretly going about getting themselves abortions in the UK, sex-selective
I think
abortions.
there's lots of accusations about what goes on in
In South Asia.
origin. In the country of origin.
Yeah.
In India.
In India, for sure. But I think in Pakistan it's not the same, right? So some of that bride burning stuff, not that people don't kill their wives, but I think some of the idea that what people are doing in India, they're definitely doing in Pakistan, and we have to fight this every time we go to conferences with South Asian specialists. It's not always the same. Different kind of concerns. Because in Islam there is all this stuff about how great it is to have a girl. You definitely go to heaven if you raise a girl well, and people would talk about that. I mean, boys have a kind of definite economic value because you keep your boys. You're renting your girls. There's all these kind of expressions about how you love girls so much more because you only have that short amount of time with them, because then they go.
This sounds like ideology which is kind of the opposite of the truth. But
Well, I mean, there was people didn't talk about. There was a lot of talk about male-female relationships and the male side of the family and the female side of the family, and it was not any kind of, and people's lived experiences of it did not, because I collected a whole lot of life histories as well. It didn't kind of follow that kind of pattern of girls not being wanted. Girls had to do a lot harder work in the house, but that didn't mean they weren't wanted.
How about extramarital affairs?
So there's some men take another wife. That goes on.
Yeah, but for the women.
Oh no. Yeah, so those become very dark stories. So I heard a number of them. Sometimes it's a story that arises around a death. So a girl was murdered in very close to where I was working, a few blocks away from a place that I spent a lot of time. And the story there, the accusation there was that that there'd been a whole lot of intrigue because a woman in the house had been having an affair, and that that's why another woman was murdered.
Not the same woman.
Right. Yeah.
Sounds like witchcraft. This is where witchcraft is coming
Yeah,
from.
yeah, witchcraft. Yeah. So then the story, then another version of the story involved witchcraft, and another version of the story involved just brutality and murder for no reason. So, yeah, I heard just kind of terrible rumors about the idea that in that house, this is what's going on. Whereas what the men were doing, it was a different kind of conversation. It wasn't that kind. It wasn't as dark. It was more kind of like white women this, white women that. So kind of blaming the women that men might be having an affair with.
White women.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
witches.
That's where the extramarital.
Yeah. Because people are so protective of women. So so extramarital stuff can be kind of tragic and result in a marriage, or seen as tragic often by the woman herself and her sisters maybe. But then that kind of resolves itself by either the first wife leaving or the first wife getting over it. And then there are these, and then there are extramarital affairs with white women that often don't result in that marriage situation. But sometimes there were divorced women who said, my husband was having an affair and we split up, and then he married that woman. Or he didn't marry that woman, he went on and married some other woman after a number of years. There was talk about it.
Any more questions? Or
Did you look at diet, and also how many women were in your sample?
So 257 in the sort of age menopause. The quantitative bit. So I did. So it's a multi-method study. So 257 women who I got quantitative data from. 19 women I did life histories on, and then obviously I spoke to untold thousands in total over the 15 months.
And the diet?
So I didn't collect, so it is almost impossible to collect really good nutritional data. Even if you just watch people endlessly, and I could not watch 257 women in the kind of detail. And I wasn't really that interested in exactly how much food women were eating, or what. So I know kind of what people were eating because I ate with them, and hung out and cooked with people, and had I asked questions about food, like what kinds of food do you like, but I did not collect quantitative nutritional data because I don't even know what I would have done with it, in a way. You know, I could have looked at phytoestrogen stuff, but I wasn't that interested in that question.
And they all had a similar diet, or did some have a much more westernized diet than others? Did you find?
Yeah, there was variation. Yeah, so there was a lot of an idea that men are the ones who want diet to be traditional, and that women would like a break and not have to cook, multiple curries and fresh bread, roti. But actually, yeah, they were fairly traditional. I don't know. Yeah, so some people would say, yeah, I also eat pasta, and I sometimes have a pizza and stuff, and I'm a very cosmopolitan, worldly person. But then sometimes I would go and have that pasta, and then that pasta would be just full. It would be a curry pasta. And they'd be like, look at my lovely... And then I would try to cook for them, and they'd be like, this is horrible. There are no Pakistani spices. And I would say, but it's not a curry. And they'd go, I think it's like, there's a thing about taste. What tastes good to you?